Welcome back. We continue our coverage on the raging Middle East conflict. Earlier, United States President Donald Trump indicated that joint strikes with Israel against Iran could continue for up to a month. For more on the escalating tensions, we are joined by Institute for Global Dialogue researcher Mikatekiso Kubayi and Dickinson College Middle East Studies chairperson Dr. Mireille Rebeiz. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us and helping us unpack what we've been seeing as some of these scenes coming from the Middle East between the US, Israel, as well as Iran. Mikatekiso, perhaps maybe let's just start when we talk about war spirals. I mean, we are seeing what started off by the US together with Israel, now escalating into something that has now included many of those countries within the Middle East. How do you perceive this current escalation, perhaps with regards to the Middle East, as a manifestation of war spirals, and what historical parallels do you think can be drawn when we look at this particular situation and the potential trajectory of what this conflict could become?
Well, it's a very important question you're asking, my sister, and thank you so much for having this conversation. You will have to recall that the United States is quite, a while away from Iran. Now, if one state attacks another, the one that is attacked, would want to retaliate. Now, Iran, does not want to retaliate all the way to the United States, and potentially cause, all manner of damage and that sort of thing, and escalate this, to, something that, would then, be a point of no return. But it would want to retaliate somewhere, and all around it in the Middle East are US assets. So, it's making a claim, an argument, that, look, we are being attacked and we have to retaliate. Where do we retaliate? Because the nearest US assets are literally, right here in, these other countries. In fact, those assets are, being used to attack us. That is the argument that Iran is making. And it makes absolute, sense. Where else, would it retaliate? It's unfortunate that you have all of these US bases literally all over the Middle East, and some of those bases were not necessarily established to look into a possibility of an attack from Iran. Others were established to look at Iraq. And other challenges that were happening over the years in that region. But there are other issues that we also have to remember about this. I mean, we talk as if this is a natural process, that Iran aggrieved someone, as if it attacked someone or harmed someone. No, nothing of that nature. I mean, we talk as if this crisis is even about the atomic possibility of creating nuclear weapons. There have been negotiations all along.
Yeah.
Why not give those negotiations a chance? While negotiating, you then attack Iran, and this is the second time. There was the 12-day war not so long ago, by the way. Not so long ago, there was a 12-day war. The same thing happened. You get Iran on, to the negotiating table. Negotiations resume, begin, and, suddenly they suffer an attack. This time, a sitting head of state has been killed. A sitting head of state has been killed, and Iran has not attacked anybody. In fact, you can even go down, recent history and look at who has attacked who and how often, around the globe. Iran is not one of those countries that would have attacked anybody. At least not to that extent that its attackers have now recently done. So there are many things that need to be looked at in this one. I would argue that it's got nothing to do with nuclear capability of Iran, etc. There are many processes. The deputy minister also reminded us of the international agreement together with Russia, the EU, and others that the United States pulled out of. And so on. There have been many efforts, at
Most
this.
certainly.
Yeah, and so this has nothing to do with that. It's got something to do with something else. We can debate that.
Right. Let's bring in Dr. Rebeiz. I mean, Mikatekiso speaks about this not necessarily being about the nuclear and the ballistic missiles that America had claimed. I mean, we saw those negotiations, them now having ended up in these airstrikes. And perhaps it's quite important for us to just take a step back into history, that it was not only now that all of this has started with regards to the negotiations not having been cleared between the two countries, but he also touched on Iraq. Maybe just talk to us about how this current conflict does compare with previous regional wars within the Middle East, such as those of Iraq and Iran, and how other conflicts are involving Israel in what we are now seeing playing out this past weekend.
First, thank you for having me. I agree that the conflict is not born, just yesterday. This has been over 50 years in the making, since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Iranian hostage crisis, and moving forward. Now, we can talk about this from an international point of view or an international relations point of view. An international law point of view, there's no doubt that the strikes on Iran are unlawful based on the United Nations Charter. It's a violation of sovereignty. It's a violation of peace. And I agree, like if we look at it from that point of view, it's definitely an unlawful act. However, it's a little bit naive to consider that this was not coming, because even though Iran may not have attacked any of these states, Iran has been a state that has been funding terrorism by proxy in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon, by funding Hamas, by funding in Palestine, by funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, which destabilized the region, quite frankly. So while Iran may not have attacked per se any of these countries, but they have a big hand in destabilizing them, not to mention funding terrorism from the 70s onwards. Now, in terms of precedent in the region, the Iraq-Iran war and the U.S. invasion to Iraq are a little bit different in that sense. And I would like to add here that there's no doubt that we're dealing with three countries that have gone broke when it comes to international law. To go back to this idea of the nuclear deal, I agree with my colleague here. It's not the nuclear deal. I mean, President Trump, in every speech he gives a different excuse. First, it's because Iran is a threat to world peace. Then Iran has nuclear weapons. Then Iran has stepped in to destabilize the United States and interfere in the elections. So the excuse on stepping in in Iran and allowing the strikes against Iran are really unclear. But here's what is clear to me, is that we're dealing with three big powers that have gone rogue, and that they all have their own different agendas when it comes to the Middle East. And the agenda is, and I'm afraid to say it, is that we are heading toward a new Middle East with new borders and new realities on the ground.
And you raise a very interesting point there now, Dr. Rebeiz, with regards to a new Middle East, new borders. We've heard constantly how apparently and allegedly Israel is looking to take over some parts of Syria, Egypt. They possibly want to move into Saudi Arabia. If we're looking at this, Mikatekiso, and Dr. Rebeiz saying that we should not be naive to the fact that this war has been a long time coming, particularly with regards to Iran having funding terrorism by proxy. What do you then make of all the pawns that are used in this process to get to some of the interests that these individual countries are looking to attain?
Well, the first thing, long time coming, I would argue, in the sense that there's been a consistent buildup of military assets in the Middle East in recent periods, right? To me that is the long time coming. I say that because there are many conflicts around the world where one powerful actor has committed, many examples, committed, such acts, in defiance of, by international law and so on. You don't hear anybody saying long time coming, for all of this. For instance, when you talk about, the genocide against Palestinian people, no one says long time coming to Israel. For instance, when you say, on the issue of Venezuela, you don't hear anybody saying long time coming, to the United States, for instance. The reality is, even if you do not like, any state, any regime, or any country, any government, it is wrong to go and kill a sitting head of state. And Africans will remember very, very painfully, the experience of Libya and, what was, done to President Muammar Gaddafi. So even if you don't like him as an individual, he was a sitting head of state. And what, has replaced him is chaos. And huge damage, that may take, a very long time, to repair in Libya. It's not for the United States or Israel or anybody else to determine for the Iranian people who must be in leadership of that country. Right? Notwithstanding the fact that Iran has been under severe sanctions for the longest time. So even, as they want to develop, improve, living standards and so on and so forth, that has been miserably difficult because of sanctions. They've been, blocked from trading in oil freely like other, OPEC, countries and so on. How are they going to generate resources? The same countries that have, made it very difficult for Iran to conduct, its economy, in a beneficial way are the ones that are taking it now. And this is not the first time. I mean, we talk as if this is sometimes as if this is a normal thing, that any country is okay. There was a horrible president there. It's fine. So let's just send someone and go and bomb them because we don't like them. It's okay. It's not okay. It's a sitting head of state. A leader of a people's. Of a sovereign nation,
right.
And there are rules that guide this kind of thing. I said, I argued that it's about something else. I would argue that it's about hegemony. In that region, it has nothing to do with the nuclear weapons. The threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. It's about hegemony. Who then becomes the big dog in the Middle East, if you like. Who becomes the big player in the region, who influences what in that space. That's what all of this is about.
Sure. Dr. Rebeiz, I mean, you mentioned earlier that what we're looking at here are three countries that have seemingly gone rogue, and you also mentioned that we could be looking at a new Middle East that is without borders. What do you think would be the benefit of the USA in having a new Middle East? Because as it is, with Iran attacking some of those military bases that are based in some of those countries on the Gulf, Saudi Arabia has come out and said, well, it seems as though the USA has abandoned them with regards to protecting them and has diverted some of their air defense to protect Israel, as opposed to them that have had some of these military bases based within their countries. What do you think really would be for the USA should there be a new Middle East?
Thank you for the question. I want to support my colleague here and make it clear. I'm not endorsing the attack in any way, shape, or form. I'm just saying that it is three countries that have gone rogue, and it's definitely illegal. Yes, definitely the United States have a long history of attacking countries under the name, the umbrella of bringing democracy and leaving the country depleted. Like we have the example of Afghanistan, we have the example of Iraq, Libya, and my colleague here mentioned Gaza and Palestine and the ongoing genocide. To answer your question, my colleague here used the word hegemony. I would even add to this the agenda of expansion. It's in the interest of the United States to have a new Middle East, and it's in the interest of Israel to have a new Middle East, and that means new borders. And then new borders mean that who controls the region, and then subsequently who controls the oil of the region. 50% of all reserve in the world come from the Middle East, and so therefore the fact that United States and Israel want to control the region is to create a greater Israel. And Mike Huckabee, which is the U.S. ambassador to Jerusalem, the other day made it clear that there is a plan of having a new Israel, and like as you mentioned, it includes parts of other countries. So the goal is to create a new Middle East with new borders, but also the hegemony, as my colleague said, but also we should not forget that it's all about oil and oil control in the region.
It certainly is. Well, let's take a quick break. We certainly will be back to further unpack what we are seeing as conflicts in the Middle East, but also most importantly, what it means for Africa. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We continue our coverage on the raging Middle East conflict. Earlier on, United States President Donald Trump indicated that joint strikes with Israel against Iran could continue for up to a month. Our panelists are still with us this evening, that being Institute for Global Dialogue researcher Mikatekiso Kubayi, as well as Dickinson College Middle East Studies chairperson Mireille Rebeiz, and that is Dr. Rebeiz, of course. Thank you so much for staying with us as we continue this conversation. As I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of what we are seeing in the Northern Hemisphere will certainly have a direct impact on those that are in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's, of course, like you mentioned earlier, with regards to energy, with regards to oil, Mikateki. So if we're looking at particularly the rest of the African continent, how badly do you think we are going to be affected by what is still to come from that conflict within the Middle East?
Thank you so much, because that's the crux, of the matter for the region, isn't it? Firstly, to say that, by the way, I agree with Dr. Rebeiz. Even in Gaza, there are reports of oil off the coast of Gaza there as well. That's another conversation as well. Now, Deputy Minister was correct. Firstly, the first thing that hits the continent would be fluctuation of currency prices. Based on this the oil trade and so on. It hits us, because immediately things start to get a bit more expensive, and some of the economic gains that we're talking about, some of the economic gains that the Minister of Finance spoke about, just the other day, suddenly, take a little bit of strain, as well. Immediately, those are the sort of issues, that we stand to face. High inflation, from their increased, cost of production and so on and so forth, right? So there are obvious, and difficult, economic consequences, to this. Now, global trade, right, is also affected by this. And, a slowdown, a disruption in global trade and global value chains will hit us, as well, quite the same, quite hard, but, this is prolonged, for instance. And there are already reports, of, by the Strait of Hormuz, the, ships, being unable to move.
Yeah.
Cargo ships, there's a whole lot of, products, goods, for trade that, can't move there. For us, there's an issue about the, coastline, in the Western Cape, and so on. The Cape of Good Hope, if you like, and that, is something, that we have to be, a little bit concerned about the attention, to this area of, this territory of ours, and the implications that it could have for security, for this country, and so on and so forth, right? But there's another more, dangerous, trend, that I feel already, there were, bombings in Nigeria, by the United States not too long ago, right? If, for instance, this kind of behavior is allowed to continue, it means that practically any state in the world, can be, bombed, by unilaterally, by any other country, as long as it happens to, be a lot more powerful and so on and so forth. And again, maybe we didn't like that regime anyway, so it's okay, we can just go and bomb them. Right? These are some of the things that, not only Africa, but the whole globe, is facing now, a level of insecurity that is brought about, by this kind of behavior. And lastly, my sister, you have the United Nations that is literally being humiliated in this instance. Two of, major incidents, in international relations this year, the kidnapping, of a sitting head of state and his wife Maduro, and now the killing, of a sitting head of state, in Iran, and with the UN, unable to do anything about it, understanding the fact that now there's also this thing called a board of peace. So there are many things, that the whole globe needs to be concerned about, right now. Not only, Africa, and, the impact, the economic impact that, this war will have.
Certainly.
On us.
Yeah. Dr. Rebeiz, I mean, there are conspiracy theories of how Israel, as well as the UAE, are allegedly funding militia such as the RSF in the war in Sudan. If we're looking at this current conflict within the Middle East, could we ever say there are any positive spin-offs that Africa could position itself in such a way that in this conflict, they would come out at a more advanced position than that which we're looking at, which is just the negative with regards to the energy and all the other ways that we would be impacted by this? Are there any positive spin-offs that Africa could intentionally position themselves in order to gain at the end of this?
To be honest, I will admit here my own limitation. I'm not a scholar or an expert on African issues, but I will say this from my humble knowledge of in the African continent affairs. I will say that from my humble knowledge, I know there is reliance a lot on European organizations and companies and the northern globe in general. And so by the simple fact that we rely a lot on the superpowers, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, that weaken inter-African relations. And so I'm thinking particularly, quite honestly, of the mining crisis in Kinshasa and the ongoing conflict in Congo. If the African continent just rises and support each other as states, I think the African continent will rule the world, to be very honest. But this is maybe a naive opinion on my end because I'm not a scholar on African matters. What I see is the reliance on the global north that weakens the position of states in Africa.
And that's a very important point. Maybe let's just close off with you, Mikatekiso, just on that very same point where Dr. Rebeiz is talking about Africa coming together, Africa being able to stand together so that the reliance is not as much as what it currently is towards the global north. We saw how a leader of the UK, Keir Starmer, has said that they would be standing with the US, who would need any assistance from some of their military bases that are based in the UK. What does this tell us about camaraderie and being in alliance with each other, especially at times such as this?
I've often said, my sister, to colleagues that, this is a long and old, a relationship. It's very tight, relationship. Many Americans actually come originally from, that part of the world, the United Kingdom, and so on. We all know the history, of the United States and how it was formed, and so on. But Dr. Rebeiz is absolutely correct. Africa all has to stand together, not only for this particular, but to respond to this particular new shock, right? It has to stand together for a whole host of other things, such as, for instance, negotiating solid developmental, trade pacts, that are in the interest of the collective continent. Because when you have a single country that is very small and having to negotiate with a behemoth of the size of, say, the United States, there's obvious huge power disparity there.
Yeah.
But you stand a much better chance of negotiating a better outcomes for yourself when you negotiate as a bloc, when you speak also with one voice in fora such as the G20, the United Nations, and others, and it makes you. Africa is a huge market, and growing. By 2050 it would be about 2.5 billion people. That's a significant market, and it's well worth remembering, that togetherness actually is a potent strength, and so on. So she's absolutely correct. I agree with that, and many have advised Africa to move along that particular course,
Right.
myself included.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. That's all we have time for this evening. That's Dr. Mireille Rebeiz, as well as who is the chairperson, rather, of the Middle East Studies, Dickinson College in the United States, as well as Mikatekiso Kubayi, who's a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Thank you for your insights this evening.